We're back on the air with Imam, Umar, Jalil. What are your thoughts about how we can better community relations with the police, with law enforcement organizations, and with community organizations? How can we bring all that together? And with the youth? I remember living right up the street in the 47th precinct. I remember an officer named Officer Lyons. I remember that being maybe just 15 years old, I had an ongoing relationship with Officer Lyons to the point where they used to strip cars in the valley. And I was kind of like a mechanical kind of kid. I like putting the cars back together or taking them apart. They were already stripped. But anyway, I would call Officer Lyons at about 2:30 in the afternoon. Hey, Officer Lyons, this car is so hot, the keys are still in the ignition. And that was real. That's how they would steal the cars. They would start them up, they would leave them there for a pickup the next night. I started noticing that, so I would call Officer Lyons, and he would show up about 3:30, do his type of paperwork, make his overtime, and that's how I really got into my photos at that time, because I used to take pictures of Officer Lyons and his partner recovering the car. It was a good partnership.
Okay.
How do we form these good partnerships again with the community?
I think that what you're talking about is community policing, and that is vital to law enforcement. That community policing operated around the concept that there were an officer or a group of officers who were a part of the community, even if something where you had to have what in our parlance, you know what I mean, a response. However, you know what I mean, when you come in, it's like, and I use corrections as an example. When you go into a housing area, right, you automatically know who is the perpetrators. Why? Because you have a community-based correction officer that's there to identify who we need to extract versus those people who are just the victims of the circumstances. And that's what community policing is. And it's two things. The two words: mutual respect. Mutual respect. Our law enforcement community, and I'm a law enforcement chaplain. Let's be clear on that point. I'm about law and order. Why? Because I'm a Muslim. Islam is about law and order, period. Our law enforcement personnel has to understand that when you take the oath of office to defend the Constitution of the laws of the United States of America, that did not endow you with Abraham qualities, Moses qualities, Jesus qualities, or Muhammad's qualities. You were not anointed the Messiah. You have to respect the community. And who is the community? Those hard-working men and women, which is 95% of any neighborhood or community, that gets up in the morning and go to work, oftentimes having two jobs to try to provide for their children. So when you come into a community, you need to understand that. On the opposite side of that, the community has to educate their children and themselves that the law enforcement people, the men and women who respond when you dial 911, is not your natural enemy. They are men and women, first of all, just like you, who have a job trying to provide for their families. We need to understand that. Let us be honest with that. Yes, now, police officers, the law enforcement personnel, they're human like everybody else. And as they always say, there's a bad apple in every bunch. But don't paint that law enforcement community with that type of brush that all of them are like that. No, they're not. And there are some, and unfortunately, the system sometimes becomes corrupt. That you mean the men and women who might want to say something oftentimes are penalized. Let us be honest with that. And I am a firm believer, right, that crime is a multi-billion-dollar business, and crime is allowed to happen where people want it to happen at. Let us be clear on that point. Let me give you an example. You go on this corner right here now, all right? And you got people just standing on the corner, doing nothing. Let's transport those people to Fifth Avenue and 57th Street. How long do you think that law enforcement would allow them to stand on that corner without a purpose?
Maybe about 3 minutes.
Right?
Maybe.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, so we allow crime to exist where we want crime to exist at. You see, and then that becomes the commentary. Because crime doesn't exist by osmosis or in a vacuum. It exists where we want it to exist at. It's like poverty. It's like poverty. Poverty is business, big business. Because how can it be? How can people get rich or enjoy in the destitute of human beings? But people do, because it's business. It's like, and we see this, so the commentary is not truthful.
But when we talk about business and we say how long will crime exist in certain communities, I remember the time when they had an organization in this community called the Thruway Homeowners Association.
Yes.
I was a member of that association because my father made me go to all those meetings.
Yeah,
and let me just say this.
Yes.
We used to have a thing called the Thruway Homeowners Patrol.
Yes.
It was a mobile patrol.
Yes.
And my nickname, my listeners might laugh at me, my nickname was Fat Albert. And I drove around in the car with my father because I liked talking on the CB. Way back then we had CBs.
Right.
And in the Workman's Circle, they had a base station. The person at that base station, their job was to call the 47th precinct with any things that we observed while we were driving around. We weren't trying to be the police, but if we observed something as my father was driving the car, if we observed something, we call the base would call the police. We don't have nothing like that.
We get back to, again, mutual respect. Mutual respect. Because law enforcement in the community is a partnership. It is a partnership. And let me tell you what the community often fears. The community often fear not relating the information to law enforcement. They fear that 1%er who's a part of the criminal element, then the information gets back to them.
No, I understand what you're saying, but
that's reality.
I think the reality is, and this is where we may differ a little bit,
okay,
is that people really at a certain point just didn't care and when I say didn't care, wouldn't volunteer to come out and just drive for an hour.
No, I'm talking what you're talking about is not different from what I'm saying. Okay. I'm talking about something different.
Okay.
I'm talking about in terms of sharing information. The old acronym, if you see something, say something.
Right.
You know what I mean? Oftentimes, people are afraid to say something because they think that the information going to get into the wrong hands and then it get back to the criminal element.
I follow you. Okay.
You see, what you're talking about is the old program of the block watchers.
The block, right.
Absolutely.
Right.
And
they don't have any more block watchers anymore.
Absolutely. And again, that's a problem of mutual respect and being involved.
Okay.
And I'm the Imam also of my own mosque. And there's a group of nuns around the corner called Pops.
Called Pops?
Pops, meaning part of the solution.
Oh, okay.
So I do HIV/AIDS education under the umbrella of the National Black Leadership Conference on AIDS. So what we do is, and they feed the homeless and those things. So I said, I like what the nuns are doing. So I went over and I said, listen, every month we do a health program. And we would like to feed at least 200 minimum homeless people. So what I want to bring some flyers to you. When you feed them lunch, you can refer them to us and we will give them a take-home hot dinner. Wow, okay. So we work together.
Together.
In an
Partnership.
interfaith partnership.
Okay.
So this is what you're talking about, partnership.
Partnership.
With our law enforcement community.
That's what I'm talking
You see,
about.
because our law enforcement men and women in uniform is not our enemy.
Right.
You see, they have good intentions but however, sometimes the system itself of corruption almost make it impossible sometimes
To form those partnerships.
the partnerships and for men and women law enforcement people to do their job.
Okay.
To do their job. You know what I mean? I'm talking about, and I'm not talking about those things which is obvious. Our law enforcement men and women in uniform are human beings like everybody else.
Right.
And just as you want to get the benefit of the doubt, don't get caught up with the signifiers who is utilizing a tragic situation. And if you notice, the so-called community activists,
Right.
the more money they get, the less active they become.
They kind of like quiet.
You understand?
Right.
Because the money quiet them down. And then, and since I'm a member of the clergy, I think we are the bigger fault in not imparting the moral and the consciousness as endowed or espoused in our religious, the tenets of our faith. I wrote a paper when I was in college entitled, "Why Did God Destroy Sodom and Gomorrah?" Right? The misinformation about history would automatically say, well, it was because of the people who had an alternate lifestyle. I said, no, you're wrong. That's the kindergarten aspect of it. I said, God destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah because the men and women who were entrusted to convey the moral and the spiritual consciousness to the ruling class became corrupt. And then God said, there's no good here, and then he destroyed it. Who is he talking about? He's talking about the clergy. Because the clergy today, you ever seen that little, I don't know what they call them, in your car, a little dog?
The bobbleheads?
The bobbleheads?
Bobbleheads.
You know what I mean? That's what the clergy is like. You know what I mean? Yes to the politicians. That's all they doing.
Yes, yes, yes.
That's all they do. And they ain't imparting no true commentary. Because how else can a group of evangelical conscious ministers say that they can just arbitrarily endorse Donald Trump?
That's a real good question.
I don't care about what your because as a member of the clergy, you're neither Republican nor Democrat, independent, anything. You
right.
are supposed to be the voice of God to the consciousness in the society, not on political talking points. No political, and that's our problem today. The clergy, the people is fine. I tell people this all the time, and sometimes people, I mean, it's what did Imam talk about? I said, you're not gonna get to heaven before the people in the churches, the synagogues, the mosques, the temples. It's the ordinary people say, I don't go nowhere. I'm just connected to God.
Connected to God. That is really the best way to be.
Yes, I'm not taking sides of nothing. I'm just trying to be the best human being that I can be. And who is the best human being? The Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessing of Allah, said, when asked about who's the best human being, many things he said that the best human being is those who want for their brothers and sisters in faith and their neighbor what they want for themselves. What was he talking about with the neighbor? He was talking about your neighbor may not be of your religiosity, but they still have rights over you to be free from the danger of your hands and your tongue. Good morning, how you doing today? In the African proverb, why? Because we understood a long time ago, before it became a talking point, that it takes a village to raise a child. We understood that. Now it's just a talking point. It's a political talking point. That's a reality. Why? Because, and I want to say this, the responsibility that our men and women in uniform owe to the community that nurtured them. Even if you decide that you want to move, after Jefferson's moving on up,
right?
you have an obligation to come back and say, Ms. Jones, how you doing today?
How you doing
Mr.
today?
Brown, how's everything going?
Right.
That's an obligation, but we have forgotten that. But
that's a moral obligation.
Yes, but as it relates to the community and the news media, have a tendency to dramatize things themselves out of proportion. Why? Because controversy sells. Because of this morbid sense that a lot of us have.
Headlines.
Absolutely. But you know what I mean? But people have to have to be mutual respect on both sides. And our officers need to understand that you have to be mindful that you are speaking to American citizens, so you don't rope them in by inappropriate language that you use sometimes.
That inmate or that person that
Yes.
you pass on the street, they could be your neighbor.
Absolutely. See, so
You know.
Yeah, so this whole this whole thing with law enforcement, and of course, it goes back to community policing.
Community policing.
You see, if you knew the people that and interact with the people that you are part that you're responsible for law enforcement, then you wouldn't be so trigger happy neither or fearful.
That's right. You hit
You
it
see,
right on the head.
but there's a difference. I tell people, this is this is one of the problems here. There's a difference in policing and surveillance. Right?
Okay.
What's the difference? Policing goes on 57th Street and 6th Avenue. In the urban or the inner city, there's no policing, there's surveillance.
Surveillance.
Big difference. There's a big difference. You see, because why? Because because there is a certain ethic and language that you use. Because in the reality of the matter is, the people don't work for you; you work for the people. And we need to be mindful of that. You see, and in the same token, the community need to realize that the officer that you see in uniform is somebody's daughter, somebody's son, somebody's mother, somebody's father, somebody's nephew, somebody's aunt. They're just like you, trying to take care of their family at the end of the day. And what are they following? They are following the mandates of what God says in Scripture. And this is indicative of all Scripture, but in the Quran it is stated in particular, O you who believe, O you who have faith, save yourself and your family from the certainty of the hellfire in this life and in the hereafter. And I think all human beings have that basic aspirations to do good for themselves, to do good for their families, and to be a good neighbor.
And on that note, being a good neighbor, we're going to end on that note, because being a good neighbor and developing good community relations with the police and our neighbors, that's what it's all about.
Yes, absolutely.